On January 20th, 2026, Donald Trump posted an image on social media. It was a map of North America. Canada was colored in American red and white stripes. Greenland was colored the same. And beside the map was an AI-generated image of Trump, J.D. Vance, and Marco Rubio planting a United States flag in the ice of Greenland. The same day, Trump told reporters there was no going back on his plan to annex Greenland. He said Greenland was imperative for national and world security. He had already asked the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to present military options for seizing the island. That was January 20th, the most aggressive single day of America's campaign to take the most strategically important piece of ice on the planet. One day later, at Davos, Trump backed down. No force, no tariffs, no annexation. A complete reversal in 24 hours. And while all of that was happening, while Trump was posting flag-planting images and demanding military options and threatening European tariffs and then reversing himself at a Swiss conference, something else was happening. Something slower, quieter, and far more consequential for the long-term strategic reality of the Arctic. For 3 years, Greenland and Denmark had been calling Canada, not Washington, not Brussels, not any of the NATO capitals that Trump was threatening with tariffs. Canada, the country Trump calls the 51st state. The country locked in the most bruising trade war in North American history. The country whose Prime Minister Trump mocks as the governor. That country was building the security framework that Greenland is now using to make itself independent of American protection. This is what really happened, and why Trump's 2-year campaign to seize Greenland produced exactly the opposite of what he intended. Before we get to Canada's role, you need to understand why Trump wanted Greenland in the first place, because the reasoning is not as absurd as it sounds. The strategic case for American control of Greenland is real. It just doesn't require annexation to achieve it. Greenland is the largest island in the world. It sits in the North Atlantic, between the Arctic Ocean and the Davos Strait. Geographically, it is on the shortest possible route for ballistic missiles traveling between Russia and the continental United States. It sits at the northern entrance to the Geuke Gap, the Greenland-Iceland-UK choke point through which Russian submarines must pass to reach the North Atlantic. It has access to rare earth minerals that are increasingly important for defense manufacturing. And as Arctic sea ice melts, it sits at the entrance to emerging shipping routes that will eventually transform global commerce. Trump has been making the case for American control since 2019, when he floated the idea of purchasing the island during his first term. Denmark called it absurd. He responded by canceling a planned visit to Copenhagen. When he returned to the White House in January 2025, the pitch resumed. By late 2025, it had become a campaign. By January 2026, it had become a crisis. The critical thing Trump kept getting wrong was the strategic premise. The United States has had a military base in Greenland since 1951. The Thule Air Base, now called Space Base, is one of the most strategically important U.S. military installations in the world. Under the 1951 defense agreement between the U.S. and Denmark, America already has all the military access to Greenland it needs. The former Assistant Secretary of State who negotiated the most recent version of that agreement said exactly this when the crisis escalated. Trump's behavior, he told reporters, threatened to undermine the access the United States already had to Greenland, because a country that is threatening to invade you does not retain the willing cooperation of your military infrastructure. Trump wanted to take something he already had the use of. And in trying to take it, he began losing it. The Greenland crisis reached its peak in January 2026 in a sequence so compressed and so extreme that it is worth walking through day by day. On January 4th, Greenland's Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen posted publicly that Trump should give up his fantasies about annexation and called the American rhetoric completely and utterly unacceptable. On January 6th, European leaders issued a joint statement declaring that Greenland's future could only be decided by Denmark and Greenland, not by the United States. On January 7th, U.S. Senator Ruben Gallego introduced a Senate resolution to block Trump from invading Greenland. Days later, bipartisan senators, Republicans and Democrats together, introduced the No Funds for NATO Invasion Act, prohibiting the use of any federal funds to blockade, occupy, or annex the territory of a NATO member state. On January 13th, NATO Secretary General Marco Rubio stated the United States was absolutely committed to NATO, a statement that, by its very necessity, told the world how close to the edge things had actually come. On January 14th, Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Rubio met with the foreign ministers of Denmark and Greenland at the White House. The talks ended without any agreement. On January 15th, European nations began deploying troops to Greenland. France sent 15 soldiers from the 27th Mountain Infantry Brigade. Germany, Sweden, and the United Kingdom followed. Denmark sent 200 additional soldiers to Nuuk and Kangerlussuaq. The Danish Army Chief General Peter Boysen flew to Greenland personally. His forces brought live ammunition, transfusion blood, and explosives designed to demolish airfields if an invasion came. This is what Operation Arctic Endurance was. A Danish-led military exercise specifically positioned to make any American military action against Greenland carry a cost that Trump had not calculated. On January 17th, Trump threatened tariffs of 10% on 8 European countries: Denmark, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Finland, unless they supported American annexation of Greenland. He was threatening to impose trade penalties on NATO allies for refusing to help him invade a NATO ally. On January 20th came the flag-planting image, the no-going-back statement, and the request to the Joint Chiefs for military options. And on January 21st, at Davos, Trump stood before the global economic establishment and pledged not to use force, not to impose tariffs on Europe over Greenland, to pursue the matter through economic means, the full reversal in 24 hours. Now here is the part of this story that has been almost entirely invisible in American coverage. While Trump was escalating threats, posting maps and asking for military options, and then backing down, Canada was quietly building something. The Canadian Rangers are one of the most unusual military units in the world. They are a reserve force. They do not carry heavy weapons. They are not equipped for conventional warfare. What they are equipped for is the Arctic. The Rangers maintain a year-round presence in the most inaccessible communities in Canada's north: Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, northern Quebec, northern Labrador. They conduct surveillance patrols by snowmobile across terrain that no conventional military unit could operate in. They provide sovereignty presence in places where the only alternative to a Ranger patrol is no Canadian government presence at all. In February 2026, a Ranger patrol conducted a 5,000-kilometer Arctic snowmobile trek. 5,000 kilometers on snowmobile through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth in February. That is the operational environment they are built for. In February 2026, Denmark sent a delegation to Yellowknife and Inuvik, specifically to observe that Ranger operation. Globe and Mail reporting confirmed the delegation's purpose. They were there to see whether the Canadian Ranger model could be implemented in Greenland's own territory. This was not a new conversation. According to Reuters, Greenland and Denmark had been consulting with Canadian officials on exactly this question for 3 years. 3 years. The consultations began in 2023, well before the January 2026 crisis. They grew more urgent as Trump's threats intensified. Whitney Lackenbauer, an honorary lieutenant colonel in the Canadian Rangers and Arctic security expert at Trent University, was the key figure in those talks. He spoke to Reuters on the sidelines of the February snowmobile expedition. His words were precise. The rhetoric coming out of the White House has sped up efforts to rebuff the idea that Arctic communities need the U.S. to come in and save them. Sped up. Not created. Sped up. The effort to build an independent Arctic security capacity in Greenland was already underway before Trump's 2025 and 2026 escalations. Trump's threats made it move faster. Now let's understand what Canada is actually giving Greenland. Because it is not troops. It is not weapons. It is not a military alliance in the formal sense. It is a blueprint, a design, a model for how to build sovereign, indigenous-rooted, year-round security presence in a territory that conventional militaries cannot effectively operate in. Greenland is home to approximately 57,000 people. It is one of the most sparsely populated territories on Earth, spread across an area larger than Mexico. The permanent ice sheet covers about 80% of the island. The population is overwhelmingly Inuit, Greenlandic Inuit, whose communities have existed in that environment for thousands of years before any European power claimed jurisdiction. The Canadian Ranger model works precisely because it is built around that reality. Rangers are recruited locally. They live in the communities they protect. They know the terrain not because they trained on it, but because they grew up on it. They are not Southern soldiers deployed north. They are Northerners already in place, given a structure and a chain of command. This is what Greenland wants. Not American soldiers from Patuxent Air Base. Not Danish troops flown in from Copenhagen. A Greenlandic version of the Rangers. Greenlandic security built by Greenlandic people using the Canadian framework. A government policy document confirmed by Reuters states that a formal plan for how Greenland might adapt the Canadian Ranger model is expected by the end of 2026. Canada opened a consulate in Nuuk in February of 2026, 1 month after the January crisis. The timing was not a coincidence. Canada had never had a consulate in Greenland's capital before. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand announced it personally and confirmed to Reuters that she meets regularly with Nordic officials on collective defense and Arctic security. The consulate is not just diplomatic infrastructure. It is the physical presence of the bilateral relationship that has been growing quietly for 3 years. The Canada-Greenland relationship is one piece of a larger architecture that has been assembling throughout 2025 and into 2026. In March 2026, Canada and the five Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, signed an agreement to deepen their cooperation in military procurement and ramp up defense production. The agreement covers cyber threats, defense industrial capacity, and what officials described as security threats across the Arctic. This is the same framework we discussed in our video about Canada's European defense pivot. But the Nordic component is specifically about the Arctic, about the territory that straddles the same polar region that Canada and Greenland share. Lackenbauer described the strategic logic. The Nordic countries and Canada, we're increasingly realizing we can come together in military and diplomatic ways to send a message that carries moral weight. Moral weight, not military weight. The message is not, we can fight the United States. Nobody in this conversation is suggesting military confrontation with America. The message is that the Arctic does not need American protection. That the Arctic nations, Canada, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, with Greenland as a partner, have the collective capacity to maintain security in their own region. That the United States is not the indispensable actor Trump claims to be. Trump's entire argument for why Greenland needs to belong to America rests on the claim that Denmark cannot protect it. Denmark is not going to be able to do it, he said. Canada just spent 3 years proving that argument wrong, not by deploying its own military to Greenland, but by helping Greenland build the capacity to protect itself. The Arctic Business Index, which tracks the 8 Arctic nations on defense investment, has historically ranked Canada near the bottom, along with Greenland. Both countries have consistently spent less on Arctic defense than Russia, the United States, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. After Trump's pressure campaign, Canada hit the NATO 2% target in 2025. It has committed to 5% by 2035. And the new spending is being directed, as we've covered, through European frameworks and Canadian industrial capacity rather than American defense contractors. The bottom of the Arctic spending table is building itself into a genuine power, using Trump's pressure as the accelerant. Now let's look at what Trump has actually achieved through 2 years of Greenland threats. He went into this campaign with the United States holding the 1951 Defense Agreement, giving America full military access to Greenland. He had Pituffik Space Base, one of the most strategically located military installations on Earth. He had Denmark's historically close alliance with Washington, stretching back to the Second World War. And he had Greenland's own openness to dialogue on its future political status. 2 years later, the situation has materially changed in every dimension. The Canadian Rangers model is being adapted for Greenland, reducing Greenland's security dependence on any external power, including the United States. Canada has opened a consulate in Nuuk, building diplomatic infrastructure that did not previously exist. A Nordic-Canada Defense Procurement Pact has been signed, integrating Canadian and Scandinavian defense industrial capacity in ways that exclude American contractors. Operation Arctic Endurance demonstrated that European NATO allies will deploy troops to Greenland to resist American pressure, with live ammunition and demolition plans for airfields. Bipartisan U.S. senators passed legislation prohibiting the use of federal funds to invade Greenland, making any future military option even less credible. Trump threatened to take Greenland to protect it from Russia and China. The effect of his threats has been to accelerate European and Canadian defense integration across the Arctic, reducing American influence in the very region he was trying to dominate. Former Assistant Secretary Frank Rose said it directly. Trump's behavior threatened to undermine the access the United States had to the Danish territory. Access that was guaranteed by a 75-year-old treaty. Access that required no threats to maintain. Access that was now at risk precisely because Trump treated a partner as a target. The most revealing detail in this entire story is the simplest one. When Greenland needed help building its own security capacity, it didn't call Washington. It called Ottawa. Not because Canada is more powerful than the United States. It isn't. Not because Canada has more Arctic military experience than the American Arctic Command. It doesn't. Canada's historical Arctic defense spending has been at the bottom of the 8-nation table. It called Canada because Canada is trusted. Because the Rangers model works. Because Canadian officials, over 3 years of quiet consultation, demonstrated exactly the kind of patient, respectful, non-coercive partnership that the other option had stopped providing. The rhetoric coming out of the White House, Lackenbauer said, had sped up the process. Not started it, sped it up. The process of making Greenland self-sufficient in Arctic security, independent of American protection, independent of Russian threat, building on Canadian expertise, was already in motion. Trump's threats turned a 3-year-old quiet conversation into a 2026 government policy document with a year-end deadline. And Canada, which Trump has been trying to bully into submission for 16 months, has spent those same 16 months building itself into the go-to partner for the territory Trump most wanted to acquire. January 21st, 2026. Davos. Trump stepped back from the edge. No force, no tariffs, no annexation. The map with the American flag on Greenland went quiet. The AI image of him planting a flag in the ice was not followed by any actual flags in any actual ice. 2 days ago, Reuters filed a story from Cambridge Bay, Nunavut, one of the most remote communities in the Canadian Arctic. The story was about a snowmobile expedition, about a reserve military unit that has been quietly operating in the frozen north for decades, about 3 years of consultations between Canadian officials and Greenland that grew more urgent as one man's obsession with annexing an island grew louder and more erratic. The headline was simple: Canada deepens Arctic defense ties with Nordics after Trump threats. Not despite Trump's threats. After them, because of them. As a direct result of them. Trump wanted Greenland for American national security. He wanted it so badly that he threatened European tariffs, asked for military options, posted flag-planting images, and told the world there was no going back, before going back 24 hours later. Greenland, during all of that, was on the phone with Canada, building its own rangers, training with its own people, opening a consulate with a country that does not threaten it, signing defense pacts with Nordic neighbors who share its values, creating the precise security architecture that makes American protection unnecessary. The irony is this: Trump's entire case for seizing Greenland was that Denmark could not protect it, that the island was vulnerable, that without American control, Russia and China would fill the vacuum. Canada just spent 3 years making that argument obsolete, and it did it without a single threat, without a single tariff, without a single social media post. Just rangers on snowmobiles, consulates in Newark, and conversations that have been growing more urgent, not because of anything Canada did, but because of everything Trump said. If you want to follow how the Canadian Rangers blueprint develops in Greenland through the rest of 2026 and what the Nordic-Canada Defense Pact means for the Arctic picture as a whole, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Real sources, real consequences, real history being made in real time. Thanks for watching.